This is a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. My name is Cully Lord. I'm a land manager and a wildlife biologist here in my home state of Florida. I invite you to join me on a journey as I seek to document the little-known stories told by those who use fire for the benefit of the land, also known as prescribed fire. So come on, let's head into the field and meet the people where the flame ends and new life begins. Welcome back to A Step Beyond the Fire. I am your host, Cully Lord, and we are here in the heart of the Ocala National Forest at a beautiful community called Salt Springs. I have a very special guest with me here today named Liz Ramirez. Now, Liz is a wildlife biologist working for the U.S. Forest Service on the Ocala National Forest, and she's been here since 2006. She's got a very broad working knowledge of fire that encompasses both wildfire and prescribed fire. Thank you, Liz, for taking the time to have a conversation with us on this episode.
Hi, good morning.
So I want to, before I get into the questions, describe for the listeners where we are, kind of what we're doing today. We're taking a walk in a recently burned area that is south of this community, and you'll hear a little bit of the road in the background. You'll hear us walking from time to time. We're talking about this project and some of the challenges that the U.S. Forest Service faces on this property, and a lot of other things in between.
So we're here in what is known as Compartment 104, and this is kind of a special project to me. As a wildlife biologist, we have a lot of areas that we're working on upgrading or creating ideal habitat for an endangered species. And we have in close proximity to this unit the red-cockaded woodpecker, also known as RCWs for short. So this area here has been identified as a potential habitat for that particular species, but the conditions of this area are just not ideal for the birds. For them to be happy, we need to have overstory, midstory, and ground cover to be at a certain structure, as silviculturalists might call it. And that just means big open timber, large diameter timber, and high visibility with long range. If you think about if you walked into a park-like setting, could you see a deer walking through the woods for like a half a mile? If the answer is yes, then you've got a lot of the major components right in line. Today, we're standing in a stand that has been a lot of silvicultural treatments implemented. So we have mechanical treatment that is brought in, and then we also have prescribed fire. And prescribed fire is the cheapest tool in our toolbox. It can do a lot of really great implementation of changing that forest structure into what we're looking at. And so today we see a lot of down debris and heavy fuels that can really implement or change the BTUs of prescribed fire. So we have to be really, we have to consider that as we're doing prescribed fire.
Now, as we walk through here a little bit, I'm seeing that some of these oaks have been mowed a little bit to a certain extent to sort of rearrange the fuel structure. When we talk about mechanical treatments, there's a lot of science that goes into it, but what it is, we're really rearranging the fuel structure so that we can burn an area, oftentimes to reduce the intensity. And sometimes it's also used as an ecological tool to open up the understory to get sunlight and to help the dynamic of the ecosystem and to help it function a little bit better. So right now we're stepping over some deadfall, some recently mowed areas for ecological purposes. So I wanted to ask you, Liz, can you tell us a little bit more about where you are today and how you got involved with this whole process of fire?
Yeah, so I've been with the Forest Service since 2004, going on 19 years, and I came here to...
So I was wrong. I said 2006.
No. I've been on Ocala since 2006.
Oh, okay. I'm right.
When I first started with the Forest Service, I was a tour guide in Alaska, and
Oh, wow.
I taught kids programs at summer camps. I interned every summer with the Forest Service until I graduated, and studied forestry and wildlife at both Florida A&M University and University of Florida. I was introduced to fire in 2006, so been doing fire for quite a bit of time, and I just fell in love with it. It was just one of those things where I really didn't know what it was, and they say once you get that fire bug, it's hard to walk away.
Yeah, I totally agree. You never really, I talked about this in the first episode, but I heard all this stuff about fire in the classroom, learning about it and how awesome it was, how great it was, but I actually never set foot on a burn until I was about 21.
Oh wow, yeah.
When did you get your opportunity to get on your first burn?
I went through a 2-week training, and then it was almost right away. I will say that Ocala National Forest has this really great opportunity where you're always we don't have a slow period. We are running and gunning all year round, and it's a really great training opportunity. But we had a prescribed fire in the wilderness, and
Is that the juniper
yeah,
Juniper Prairie Wilderness? You can look it up on a map. It's a very interesting area that's kind of right in the center of the forest, basically, right?
Yeah, it's a really, really beautiful wilderness. It's got a hiking trail that the Florida National Scenic Trail runs through. There's primitive camping that's allowed all year long. And we also have the 7-mile canoe run that goes through it, and then camping.
So by wilderness, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's a designation given to minimize basically human disturbances, correct?
Yes.
As opposed to the greater Ocala National Forest, where there's nature-based recreation happening, like hunting, fishing, and those kinds of things, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There is the Wilderness Act that was implemented to preserve certain areas of the forest and allow limited access via anything that has a gear. So bicycles and chainsaws, anything of that nature is not allowed into the wilderness.
Okay.
Anything that's primitive is allowed. And that means horseback riding is allowed, hiking is allowed, but you can't take a bicycle. Technically, you can't bring a camera, but they've let that one slide.
Oh, really? You can't take a camera?
Well, a camera has gears in it, and that's not primitive.
Oh, I guess it... Yeah, that makes sense then. Now it makes more sense to me, because I was in a wilderness area out west one time, and I was on a bicycle with my friend, and the folks that we ran across on horseback were very angry that we were there, and they said we weren't allowed to have motorized vehicles.
Yes.
But my argument was that it's a mechanized at best. It's a mechanized vehicle at best, but if the whole gear thing, that's
the limitation. And there are some wildernesses that have an exemption for one thing or another. 2 of our wildernesses out of the 4 on Ocala have an exemption to allow hunting.
Oh,
and 2 of them do not.
I see. Well, that makes a lot of sense then. So any of our visitors who are wanting to go to a wilderness area, that's really the best place to get immersed in nature with as little human disturbance.
Yeah, and that's part of the trammel, right? We're trying to prevent the recreator from interacting with something that's going to disturb their solitude, their peace. That's what we're trying to give them is that ambiance of a wilderness when they're walking through there. So, but yeah, that was my first fire, was in 2006, and it was kind of a big deal. We had set a prescribed fire, and then the ponds were supposed to hold certain ecosystem. That ecosystem there is the sandpine scrub. It wasn't supposed to burn like it did. And instead of a 2,000 acre burn, it turned into like a 12,000 acre burn.
Whoa,
and it turned into a wildfire.
That was your very first burn?
That was one of my very first burns. I was supposed to leave out west to go to a Western detail where you go for 2 weeks, and I had declined because of some scheduling conflicts, and then the juniper had turned into a wildfire that went for 2 weeks. I was like, well, perfect. I have my own at-home fire assignment that I'm getting to be able to partake in.
So the burn itself unintentionally became a wildfire. And that's one of the interesting things I think we should talk about a little bit more, is that the planning process. In the episode with Tracy, we talked about that and how complex it can be. There's many different things that you're looking at when you're actually planning a burn. Everything from the weather to the burn, selecting the burn area itself, and the control lines that are on the boundary of the property that you're burning, weather observations, and sometimes even the best laid plans can actually turn out very unexpected. Weather conditions the day of can very much be. It happened to me the other day where there was one thing was predicted and another thing happened. Was that what happened that day?
We were predicting rain and we didn't get it for 2 weeks, and that changed everything. And when you have a prescribed fire, you have the local resources that are your fire personnel and your fire equipment. We are lucky that on this forest we have a helicopter on standby for 11 months out of the year, and it is a great resource for, aerial detection and aerial application of dumping water using a bucket. But once you get to a certain point, your prescribed fire is too expensive, and you need to transition it as far as its status from a prescribed to a wildfire in order to justify getting more money, because now this prescribed fire has run its course and is using up all of the funds. You use up too much out of that pot, now you can't pay for prescribed fires in other areas, so you have to kind of switch the label.
So do you get to ride in a helicopter?
I have, and it's really fun. It's awesome.
That's great. I've had one experience with a helicopter my whole life, and I was on a Fish and Wildlife Commission helicopter, and it's a long story, but at one point during the flight, I was in the back. I was not riding co-pilot, so I was in the back, and the door flew open as we were crossing I-75.
Oh dear.
And I screamed over the radio. I said some curse words that my supervisor had never heard me say before, because I had to reach my hand out and grab that door and slam the thing back shut. But,
it didn't fly off. It stayed. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, the door was still on, and it scared me. Because, all of a sudden, it's just, boom, that thing just slammed against the... And then,
oh, wow, that would be a really scary
But
scenario.
it was my fault because I didn't latch the handle like I was supposed to, so eventually that thing came open. So anyway, the helicopter, we talked with Tracy about some of the ignition techniques in the helicopter being used as another tool in the toolbox to implement prescribed burning. So I want to bring us back to where we're standing right now, because I'm seeing some plant species that are already rebounding after the burn. Can you talk a little bit more about when this burn happened and what we're seeing on the ground cover right here?
This particular area has been under works for a couple of years now. Like I said, we're trying to get this one back to ideal habitat conditions for a particular species. But that species, the red cockaded woodpecker, is known as an umbrella species. What we do for one species encapsulates the habitat needs for a bunch of other species too. So we call that an umbrella.
So the umbrella metaphor is meant sort of in a literal sense, in that it's creating a broad effect that encompasses many species.
Yeah.
When you do action for one species,
Yep,
which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and right after a fire, you'll see the mounds created by the gopher tortoises. They create a burrow underground that over 300 species have been documented using as a refuge.
It's amazing.
Especially during fire. And then we also have indigo snakes, Florida mouse, and even other species that are not endangered will benefit from the works that we're doing. And so we've been doing the mechanical treatment here and then we'll bring in fire afterwards to kind of reduce a lot of that slash that has been dropped down. And this unit was burned last week. We're looking at right now wiregrass that's already about an inch and a half tall coming up out of the ground. It is an amazing view in Florida to see how fast things grow. And what a lot of people don't understand is that fire just kind of is a haircut. It just kind of clips the top off, and then everything from all of its carbohydrate reserves underground, it's just resprouting almost instantaneously.
Wiregrass is one of those species that sometimes I've seen it 2-3 days after a burn pop up. And it's also considered a keystone species in and of itself because it creates a structural component that allows fire to move across the landscape because it's flammable and it has a certain structure that facilitates the movement of flames across the landscape. And it's always one of those species that whole renewal process and the regrowth and the rebirth that happens after a burn. I always love to see that because that it's not going to be that long. Maybe another couple months from now, it's going to be almost as big as
green.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of green in the landscape here.
And wiregrass is actually one of the required components of the red cockaded woodpecker habitat. We need that to facilitate our burns that we try to have on a high frequency but low intensity. And that wiregrass really helps to carry it.
So as we talk about the RCW, it reminds me, you and I worked together for several years here on the Ocala National Forest. I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Commission, and we both had overlapping roles, but I was more of a helping out on prescribed burns where I could, and also helping out on the red cockaded woodpecker projects that you have been involved with for a long time. And I remember us using the Nest cameras and measuring the height of the cavities from the ground and entering all that data into the system. Is there anything going on with that project right now that has it's been a major shift in as far as challenges or opportunities go?
I think a big challenge for anyone that is collecting data is the data itself. And you want to make sure that when you're collecting the data, good data in, good data out, right? And we use technology to collect that information. And we have smartphones, smart devices, tablets that have an app for that. And originally we were using a Tremble device that was always having connection issues with the satellites.
I remember that thing was expensive. It was this big yellow, it was like a brick, where you had this had your little pin and you're entering in stuff, and
we literally would have to hold it outside of the window for it to pick up satellites for it to tell us where we were so we could navigate to the next location. And then you would get to the tree, but the cloud cover was too much or the tree cover was too much, and then it would just drop. There'd just be certain times of the day where all of the satellites in the sky just weren't lined up for you, and you just had to you had to do something else.
Had to figure it out.
And I have to say that has been a huge obstacle that we have leapt over now with the invention of all of these new apps and GIS and ISRI really pulling their weight to create some applications that have moved that data collection forward in a really better way. We've got live data mapping, we've got shareable applications, and we still have things that will fail. It's a human developed application, so there is going to be some inherent flaws in that, but man, we are getting leaps and bounds from where we were with some other tech that we used to do. No longer do I carry a piece of paper to collect the information. It is all in a smart device.
It's a different world that we live in for wildlife managers.
Yeah, and the biggest challenge, I think, for many of us in this industry is that we wear multiple hats. I might be out in the field today for doing an RCW survey, but I'm also always looking for invasive species that has to be controlled. And I'm also looking for where's the next project that needs to happen. And I'm also, so like, there's always these things that are happening, and having that smart device that can change between those applications of information that you have to feed it really helps out too. Cause I'm like, I'm not worried about, oh wait, I don't have that map. Nope, it's in my back pocket.
Yeah, that's great. I love that, because technology can be a double-edged sword, but it can also be another, again, tool in the toolbox that we use to make good decisions, to make science-based decisions that we can make in a much more clean and organized way, where there's not necessarily a paper trail, but there is a way of analyzing data and getting it into the hands of the managers and folks that really need that information in a much sooner and a much more systematic way. And I love that. So I want to talk a little bit about your overall career and things that you've experienced along the way. Why does this profession make you happy?
Man, how much time do we have today?
As much time as you want. It's more of a bigger, bigger picture question.
There was a time when we had to do early morning surveys for the birds, and those are called roost checks. And it literally means that you need to be out in the woods before the birds wake up and start their day. Well, I had a long commute to work, and that meant that I had to be up at 4 a.m. to get to this site, and I'm not a morning person. So as soon as I got to the site, I sent a message to my boss, who was monitoring my location because our dispatch wasn't on yet. So I think it was like 5:30 in the morning, and I'm out in the field, and I'm exhausted. My coffee hasn't set in, and my boss replies, "Enjoy the day. Observe all of the nocturnal animals switching over to your daylight animals." And I realized at that point that there are so many folks that they have to take time off of work and pay to come out and do the things that we get to do on a day-to-day basis. This job is a vacation destination. And
it is, yes. There's a lot of people that come here to the National Forest to come
and recreate,
to get away from it all, to enjoy the outdoors.
And here we are today taking a walk through the woods, and this is my happy place.
I saw some deer tracks just a second ago too, and as we're walking along this sandy path, this is a pretty typical path that folks take when they drive their Jeeps, and they're sometimes off-roading vehicles that are not supposed to be here. But anyway, there's a lot of the outdoor recreation happening here. One of the things we just picked up something off the ground a second ago. Tell me about that, Liz.
Yeah, so sorry to completely derail the conversation, but
no.
We've got a ping pong ball, and it's a pink colored, small, I guess a 1-inch diameter ball.
And it was just laying in the little path that we were walking.
Yep, it was laying in the sand. And what's neat about this is that this is part of our prescribed fire technique that we use with the helicopter.
So that came from a helicopter, and it landed right there, and we just happened to step across it. Yeah, that's cool.
Yep. And this is part of the technique where a chemical will be injected into this plastic ball. It looks like a ping pong ball, almost like a Pokemon ball.
Right.
Half white, half pink. And it has a powder inside, and when the helicopter operator injects a liquid fluid in it, it will have a delayed ignition. And when it drops out of the helicopter, because you don't want to be instant with a helicopter, it'll fall onto the ground, and then it will ignite the ground on fire. Another thing that just popped up is a gopher tortoise burrow.
Yeah, we're walking along the path here, and we see a gopher tortoise burrow, which we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I just saw something go in there.
It might have been a fence lizard or a scrub lizard. Those are pretty common out here.
I see, yeah. That's what it.
One
Yeah,
of
something new to
my
me.
volunteers from University of Florida, they were doing some burrow scoping, and they found an alligator. It was small.
In the gopher tortoise burrow. Wow, that's a new one for me.
Yeah.
That's a new one for
I
me.
think we're at 300 and something, but it's quite a bit of species that use.
That's
use burrows.
fascinating. That's really fascinating. So the gopher tortoises create a haven for many other types of species, like we were talking about.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of the reason why I like this job. There's always something that's happening. The diversity of tasks are really broad, and what you get exposed to always kind of challenges your mind. We've got American crows that are having a very healthy conversation.
They wanted to join in. They saw we were having a conversation here, and they just couldn't resist.
Yeah, there's also in the background there was a few Bachman sparrows that were flying around, and right after a burn, it's kind of like coming to the Golden Corral, to be honest. It is a buffet with barbecued everything. So there's a lot of critters that'll come in and really enjoy a good meal.
I love that period after the burn where you see lots of wildlife coming to the buffet. And so speaking about the ignition and holding, I wanted to elaborate on this just a little bit more to help our listeners understand this second operational phase, which is a very critical part of the whole process when a burn actually happens. So it encompasses many things, which from having a good briefing all the way to the actual process of how you're putting fire on the landscape and deciding when and if you may need to put it out. What does this phase mean for you when you're managing a burn and going through this process? And how has it shaped your understanding of fire?
Well, I want to start off with a small story. So let's take a minute and think about you're in the woods and you've got a fire that's rolling through the forest. This fire is low to the ground. It's only about 1 to 3 feet tall, and it's very lightly, slowly going through the forest. Most of it has the wind at its back, so it's just very slowly creeping through the forest. As it goes through the forest, there's consumption of all of the fuel, so it leaves this black scar behind it. And it doesn't go very high up into the trees, just kind of consumes everything on the ground. When it goes out, you've got a beautiful scene of, again, the fuels are gone, but then within a week or two, all the grasses start to really come back.
Everything's rebounding, yeah.
Now, let's change the scene a little bit to a fire that now is 20 to 30 feet tall. It's climbing through the vegetation that's attached to the trees, known as lateral fuels. And that fire is so intense that it's climbing the trees via the lateral fuels and setting the crowns on fire. The wind picks up and it takes that crown fire and spots it or throws embers ahead of it. That crown, a mile ahead, starts on fire and rains down fire, falls to the ground. And now you have fire moving at the crown level and at the ground level, so on the top and bottom.
So it's just all encompassing and rolling through like a freight train.
Yes, exactly. And your trees are dying. They are so heavily encapsulated in the heat that it's known as a catastrophic fire or a stand replacing fire. Those trees are toast.
Stand replacing meaning the forest stand, all of the overstory, all the big trees.
Yep, everything in its path is destroyed. Now, if I ask you which one of those is a natural fire for that ecosystem, what would you say?
I'd say the lesser of the two.
Right. Well, the answer is they're both natural, and they're both actually really imperative depending on the ecosystem. If you use that in the wrong spot, then it could be detrimental for the future of the stand.
So if we use that here on this nice longleaf pine savanna that we're looking at, that's not what you want to do.
Correct. You want the lesser of the two, or the former of that description. You want a low intensity, but high frequency. So that fire is going to be coming through here quite often and burning out a lot of the forbs and grasses, replenishing them, and they grow back really fast. But the Ocala National Forest has a sand pine ecosystem. This scrub ecosystem has pine trees with cones that are known as serotinous. They need heat. They need heat in order to open up. The cones are sealed with resin, and the heat will release the seeds, and then they can replace. So sand pine scrub actually needs a catastrophic stand replacing fire in order to replenish.
So it needs the freight train to roll through once every, how long?
They are way less frequent. We're talking about 30 years would be ideal to reset the landscape. Sand pine is a pine species that gets old at 40, 50 years. After that, they just kind of rot in place and fall down. So the National Forest will harvest them at around 30 to 40 years in order to create a marketable timber to take to the mill.
So it's a benefit for not only the stand itself to remove those trees for ecological purposes, but you also have a utilitarian purpose where it generates there's a financial side to it too.
Right, and it seems counterintuitive to think that clear cut would create wildlife habitat, but it does. We have another endangered species known as the Florida scrub jay that benefits from a stand that has been reset. And fire can create that. And it's really important to think about your ignitions because you need to know what type of ecosystem that you're in order to really understand how that fire is going to behave. It is weather-based and it is, location-based. But when we're talking about doing ignitions and looking at, okay, we're going to start it over here, we also have to have contingency plans in case something changes. Like I said before, weather can change, a wind can shift.
Contingency meaning that is you have a backup plan to when things don't go the way you want them to go. That's what we talk about.
Yeah.
That's what we mean. And that's part of the planning and evaluation process at the beginning. Before you conduct a burn, you have to think about these things.
Right.
Yeah.
So the unit that we're in right now, we're walking through an internal road that was a contingency plan. If the conditions didn't line up right, or if the day went way longer than we had anticipated, then we would have a stopping point that we could cut the fire off, hold what we've got, and then come back the next day or the next appropriate burn day, as they call it, when all of your environmental factors line up, and then do it again.
Because sometimes when a burn is being conducted, you have to kind of see how things are going. If they're not going so well, if you have the option to stop and call it quits early, that is a very valuable thing. And that's where we're at actually right now, is we're stepping along this path that was their option for the day, was to stop here if they needed to.
Actually took 3 days to burn. And the first day that we started at 10 a.m. We didn't stop ignitions until 6 p.m.
Wow.
So we had to kind of...
That was a long day.
It was a very long day.
Well, and you have the road. You hear the road in the background. That's on the northern boundary of this unit too. So there's smoke management considerations, and the ignition tactics have to be adjusted for that accordingly.
Yes.
During the day to account for those kinds of concerns, because we have to think about the safety and welfare of the public as they're traveling through this pretty well-traveled corridor.
That's correct.
Along State Road 19 here, right?
Yes. And there's a 60-page document that we have written months ahead of time, and then
60 pages? Did you write that?
I did not. That's above my pay grade.
Woo, man, that's a lot of admin work right there.
Yeah, and it's done well ahead in the beginning of the year for all of the burn units that are planned for that year. And that way, when the conditions line up perfectly for any one of those units, that unit's ready to go. They get a shorter, I think it's like 6 pages, document ready It gets signed off by the state. It gets signed off by our district ranger.
Meaning the Florida Forest Service state,
Yes,
correct?
yeah.
They're the
Yeah,
leading
they
entity
are
on.
the ones that issue the burn permit.
So you have to get, the federal government has to get a permit from the state government,
Yeah.
which is
It's a little
pretty unusual,
Yeah.
if you ask me.
Yeah,
Usually it's the other way around.
But that is our safety net, is making sure that we are
Right.
doing our due diligence to ensure that the burn is safe.
Right, right. Well, that's great. That's a great insight there. Oh, there's those deer tracks again. See 'em. We're walking back towards Salt Springs now. So one last question I wanted to engage on you with for our listeners here. What is one memorable life experience from the field that stands out as an event in your mind that you learned a lot from?
Yeah, I have to say that after a scrub unit, or an area that has sandpine scrub in it, has been clear cut, they'll do another silvicultural practice called a roller chopper. And that just means that they are breaking up the fuels and creating bare ground, open spaces. And that scrub jay needs areas to cache their acorns or hide away and bury their food sources for later. Well, we go back through there and we'll do a prescribed fire through a clear cut in a scrub unit. I thought that that was going to be like an easy day, not a lot of smoke, quick fire. I was wrong. I have never eaten so much smoke where the smoke was just super heavy in your face. We were doing patrol with a UTV. It was whiteout conditions because of how thick the smoke was. You couldn't see in front of you, so you had to go very slow. Lights on, paying attention, communication with radio. And you were walking through the unit with drip torches to ignite it. But you have to imagine walking through an area like you were in the marching band, because you're constantly lifting your legs as high as possible to
That's exhausting.
Climb over all of the slash that's on the ground. You're exhausted.
Kind of like what we were doing earlier, walking across the slash, but to a much higher degree.
Oh,
I
yes.
guess.
And then there's limbs that are sticking out. So you come out.
Trip hazards.
You're black and blue because it's been stabbing you.
Yeah.
And it was exhausting. The fire intensity there was so high that at one point there was a wind condition that was perfect to create a fire whirl. And it sounded like a train coming through when it had passed over the fire. It was really cool to see that, but I was absolutely floored that this was not a very easy, light type of fire. It was a lot.
Yeah, I must confess. So I was on a prescribed burn, which I'm not sure if you were there that day. I was helping out some of your crew. This is back in 2017, where I saw one of those fire whirls on a recently roller chopped. So I was on a burn similar to what you're talking about, and the fire whirl that I saw, it sounded like a city bus just coming through.
Yeah.
And it was the biggest one I'd ever seen too. And this is a fire tornado we're talking about.
Yeah.
Where conditions in the atmosphere are a little bit, the dispersion is a little high, so it creates some unstable air, and the conditions create this dust devil / fire tornado that I remember being fascinated by it and watching this thing. I was only, I don't know, I could throw a football and hit this thing, but suddenly after a minute or two, I thought, what if that thing comes towards me? What am I going to do? So, and about that time, it started easing along and coming my direction. And I kind of stepped across this big sandy road and watched it as it rolled across the area and then across the road, and it threw a bunch of embers onto an unburned area we didn't want the fire to go into. So that for me was like this moment of, holy cow, that was but there are contingencies for these things.
Yeah. There was
folks available to handle the situation. However, good learning experience. And the fire whirls, you guys see a lot of those.
We
here in
do
Ocala, I
have
feel like.
a lot of opportunities for those conditions to present themselves. I've seen most of the time it's just little, like they call them the dust devils.
Right.
But to have fire in that and create that fire tornado or that fire whirl, depending on how big it is, it's impressive. It'll stop you.
Yeah. That's all we have for our episode, folks. Thank you again, Liz, for joining us. And I'm thankful that you've helped us learn from some of your awesome experiences. It's been real and it's been fun. And it's also been real fun.
Yeah.
Getting the experience here and letting you lead us as we take another step beyond the fire.